Did viruses evolve? What about those superbugs in the hospitals? And what about these new fossil cave people? Are they our half-ape, half-human ancestors? We answer these questions and more, and of course, we dive into our mailbag that's bursting at the seams. This is Genesis Week. And welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy. Excellence in pirate broadcasting we set up this week in the Buckner Building so we can continue to bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear. And giving glory to our Creator while doing it. God did not say, "Come, let us be unreasonable together." But we here at Genesis Week believe God gave you a brain for a reason, and we want to use our brains to find the truth along with you. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com and you will find us. While you're there, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and get extras like Crevo rants and interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. An open access paper published in Biomed Central examining giant viruses drew some pretty dramatic conclusions and made a radical proposal. Citano and Knowles et al. Suggested that at least some viruses should be their own distinct super kingdom. Now, some have suggested in the past that viruses were perhaps the first life. In fact, for many years, you could hear this over the audio tour of the Canadian Museum of Nature. However, viruses can't reproduce. Viruses hijack the reproductive system of cells and get those cells to churn out copies of the virus. So, obviously, they cannot be the first life because they need other life to exist. The authors acknowledge this in the article. We propose that the viruses we've analyzed coexisted with primordial cells. The premise of the research was to compare protein folds in various viruses and numerous other living things. They made an assumption that the more organisms that had the same protein fold, the older the fold must be. The resulting oldest protein folds were also found in the giant viruses. Therefore, they concluded that the giant viruses were the oldest viruses. Now, while there are assumptions involved here, it's interesting because the creationary interpretation may not actually disagree with these assumptions or conclusions. But notice that this caused the authors to conclude that this was de-evolution. They wrote saying, viruses evolved via massive and primordial reductive evolutionary processes. Emphasis on the words massive and reductive. This was a huge loss of genetic information over time. This is significant for a couple of reasons. One, this is the opposite of upwards onwards, gaining complexity evolution. The viruses were losing complexity and information. Two, this shows that viruses, along with the rest of life on Earth, are also deteriorating and were better than they are now. This matches the creation account of a perfect world which has been corrupted and becomes even more significant when you read a very interesting comment the authors made. Since viral domains are widespread among cellular species, we propose that viruses mediate gene transfer between cells and crucially enhance biodiversity. Translation: we need viruses. Now, this is interesting because Dr. Jerry Bergman, influenced by his creationary beliefs, wrote precisely on this subject back in 1999. Viruses have a very bad rap. Even their very name is the Latin word for poison. And of course, the images invoked in the minds of people when they hear that word virus are not pleasant images. Disease, sickness, a cold, the flu, viral meningitis, polio, and rabies. One has to wonder, why would a good God create such things? I mean, viruses are astonishingly complex and appear designed to specifically interact with the living world. Why on earth would God do such a thing? The reality of viruses is quite different from what we think we know. You are infected by viruses all the time and don't even know it. Viral sickness is evidence of things gone wrong. I'll let Dr. Bergman explain it. Mathieu and Sonia claim that viruses convert all bacteria into one giant global superorganism, and that viruses possess a remarkable mechanism for the creation and exchange of genetic material. In contrast to its public image, bacteria are at the basis of our life support system. They supply our fertile soil and atmospheric gases. They cleanse our water supply, play a role in stabilizing the atmospheric nitrogen concentration, regulate the acidity or alkalinity of the soil environment, and thus generally ensure that our world is livable. Viruses and bacteria and all of life tie together. Viruses play a major role in spreading genetic information among organisms, particularly bacteria. Viruses that are bad for you appear to be viruses which have deteriorated. They are sick viruses, if you will, which cause sickness. They are deteriorating, just like the rest of life on Earth. This is not the way things were originally designed. You can read more in Dr. Bergman's article, which is available online here. Interestingly, this also tied in with the news of an interest from the past few weeks, and a question I got from Kevin in Newfoundland. Do you know much about the super viruses, the ones in hospitals? Thanks for writing in, Kevin. I already dealt with the super viruses just now, but Kevin is actually referring to super bacteria that doctors are seeing in hospitals, which are immune to antibiotics. Now, many people have claimed that this is evolution in action. The bacteria are evolving a resistance to antibiotics. Well, actually, it isn't evolution in action at all. I go into more details on alleged bacterial evolution in Crevo Rant number 80. Nylonase is not new information. But bacteria resistance to antibiotics is just simply a change of population. We're killing off the bacteria that are susceptible to antibiotics, and the only ones that are left are those that are immune. This past summer, Parks Canada launched an expedition to find the ships and any remnants of the failed Franklin expedition. CBC has been carrying extensive coverage of the research, which has pretty much now stopped for the season. The Franklin expedition was a two-ship exploration party that attempted to sail through the last unnavigated section of the Northwest Passage in 1845. Sadly, the two ships became stranded in the ice, and Franklin and 128 men died. Several crewmen were buried on Beechey Island, and their remarkably well-preserved corpses exhumed in the 1980s. Researchers at the University of Alberta wound up with revived bacteria from the intestines of the bodies, bacteria that had been buried and frozen 150 years prior. But that wasn't the real surprise. As Ed Struzik wrote in the Sydney Herald, scientists at the University of Alberta have revived bacteria from members of the historic Franklin expedition, who mysteriously perished in the Arctic nearly 150 years ago. Not only are the 6 strains of bacteria almost certainly the oldest ever revived, says medical microbiologist Dr. Kinga Kowaleska-Grochowska, 3 of them also happen to be resistant to antibiotics. In this case, the antibiotics clindamycin and cefoxitin, both of which were developed more than a century after the men died, were among those used. So in other words, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria were already around over 100 years before antibiotics were even invented. These resistant bacteria have always been around, but when you kill off those susceptible to antibiotics, you only have the resistant ones left. And that's not evolution, that's de-evolution. You just removed variation from the gene pool. You just lost information, the opposite of upwards, onwards evolution. I had previously reported on the DNA extraction from some fossil bones found in a cave in Siberia. The bones were from a peoples named after the cave and were called the Denisovans. Many dramatic claims have been made regarding these ancient humans, and a lengthy comparison of the DNA was made trying to determine how close they were to humans, apes, Neanderthals, etc. Now, the first remarkable thing to note is the fact that the scientists were actually able to extract DNA from this fossil that was alleged to be 80,000 years old. Now, this age is already incompatible with the biblical timescale of 6,000 years. But considering that age is also incompatible with the age of 30,000 to 50,000 years old assigned to the sediments the fossils were found in, obviously, I'm not too concerned about the alleged dates. There was also huge evolutionary assumptions made to arrive at the 80,000-year-old age. And the first question mark that should be raised is how on earth DNA was able to remain even remotely intact for so long. Now, a major focus of the research was how to extract DNA in such bad shape, and kudos to the researchers who developed a new method. Because the double-sided DNA strand tends to break apart into single-side, the researchers developed a method of collecting and assembling single-side DNA. But, the new method aside, we can study the decay rates of DNA, as Dr. Daniel Criswell explained in a Creation Research Society quarterly paper. Kinetic calculations predict that amplifiable fragments less than 400 base pairs will survive no longer than 10,000 years at temperate conditions. Dr. Theodore Syke also emphasized the fact, "My chemistry and biochemical intuition revolts at the suggestion that DNA can be found in recognizable form after 10,000 years. The bones were also found in a cave which, while cooler, is notoriously wet, and water is the worst enemy of DNA. But, using the new technique to extract the DNA fragments and then piece them back together into one long strand, they were able to get a DNA sequence so complete that it was comparable to taking your DNA sample. They were able to determine that it was a girl with brown skin, brown eyes, and brown hair. Nevertheless, with the DNA sequence in hand, the researchers were able to compare it to modern humans and chimpanzees. They found that there were fewer differences between the Denisovans and chimpanzees than modern humans and chimpanzees. The implication being that the Denisovans were closer to the chimpanzees than we were. Clearly evidence for evolution. Really? Well, isn't that interesting? Because the researchers also concluded that the Denisovans had interbred with humans. Wait a minute. By definition, if they bred with humans, that means they were able to mate and have fertile offspring, which means they were human. In fact, in the report in Science magazine, we read, "On the autosomes, the Denisovan individual differs on average 1,017 transitions and 508 transversions per million base pairs from a human sample, while the 11 humans differ on average by 717 transitions and 379 transversions from each other. The autosomes would add up to about 3 billion base pairs. That's all of the DNA except for that found in the sex chromosomes. Well, by my math, that's about 4.575 million nucleotide changes in the autosomes of 3 billion base pairs. It's interesting to note that a second paper came out months after the Denisovan paper was accepted for publication. Tishkoff et al. Published their DNA sequence of several modern tribes of isolated people in Cameroon, Sandawe, and Tanzania, all in Africa. If one uses the differences in DNA between the Denisovans and modern human database to try and depict the Denisovans as subhuman, the tables are suddenly turned. As we see from the African study, the Pygmies and Yoruba tribes are more different from the modern human database than the Denisovans are. The Denisovans do not provide evidence for evolution at all. Everything about the Denisovans is completely human, even more human than modern humans. Dr. Dennis Venema is an associate professor and department chair for the biology department at Trinity Western University, Langley, British Columbia, here in Canada. He wrote a guest essay for the BioLogos Forum a couple of weeks back, talking frankly about his personal feelings teaching evolution in an evangelical university and explaining some of the methods he uses to teach evolution. After detailing a typical classroom lesson, he writes, "Lest anyone think that this post is an attempt to present an overly optimistic or whitewashed view of teaching evolution in an evangelical setting, let me acknowledge and affirm that the pain that many, yes most, evangelical students go through as they learn about evolution is substantial and real. I've had too many long conversations with students caught between their faith communities and the science to deny this reality. I've seen students struggle with their faith, close their minds to the scientific evidence, and even resolutely declare that no amount of evidence would ever be enough to convince them that evolution is real. I've seen anger, hurt, and fear. I have seen students willing to discard nearly the entirety of modern science in order to maintain a particular anti-evolutionary view. I really respect his honesty, even if what he is teaching and its consequences are quite disturbing for multiple reasons. Now, I was first of all disturbed by the first hypothetical classroom instruction Dr. Venema used, that of the alleged chromosomal fusion in humans. Now, let me explain so you can see why I find it disturbing. Our DNA is clustered together into bundles of DNA called chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs of them, while chimpanzees have 24 pairs. Yet, we were supposed to have diverged from a common ape-like ancestor. So the evolutionary argument is that, somewhere along the way, humans fused two chromosomes together. DNA is made up of four chemical letters, A, G, T, and C, all put together into a long, double-sided strand. At the end of the strands in the chromosomes, there are long sequences called telomeres. Telomeres are markers for the end of the DNA strand, and they are simply thousands of repeats of 6 letters, TTA, GGG. So if our ancient ancestor fused 2 chromosomes together into one, we should see a telomere sequence right in the middle of a chromosome, right? The chromosome pairs also have a binding point where the pairs link, called centromeres. There should be 2 centromeres in a fused chromosome, but a chromosome can only have one, so evolution would need to deal with the second centromere, but there should be evidence of a former centromere in a fused chromosome. Dr. Kenneth Miller has been a very vocal proponent of this theory, and even brought this up at the Kitzmiller-Dover trial, claiming that there are telomeres right at the spot where the fusion allegedly happened on human chromosome number 2. Obviously, Dr. Venema is teaching the same thing in his classes on evolution, but the reason this is disturbing is because it's dead wrong. An article put together by Drs. Tompkins and Bergman is available for anyone who cares to read, detailing just how wrong this claim is. For example, the alleged telomere in the number 2 chromosome isn't a telomere. Now, there are a few single telomere-like sequences, but those are fairly common in DNA, and they certainly don't make up a cluster of thousands in a row. Furthermore, there are these telomere sequences before and after the alleged fusion site. Did it fuse more than one place? Thirdly, almost all of the chromosomes have these telomere lookalikes. Well, just how many fusions has the human race undergone in its history? Fourth, if there was 2 chromosomes that fused end to end, we should see thousands of telomere sequences back to back, with a good chunk of them reversed to the first. Of course, this is non-existent. With the release of the data from the ENCODE project, which I mentioned last week, it turns out the alleged telomere sequence, surprise, has function. In other words, it's not a telomere. It is actually genes, pseudogenes, and open reading frames. Fifth, the DNA sequences in the chimpanzee chromosomes that allegedly fused should then match the human fused chromosome sites on either side of the fusion zone. But once again, this prediction failed miserably. Lastly, the whole point of telomeres is to keep chromosomes from fusing to each other. As for the centromere, the evolutionary researchers have claimed that there is a badly deteriorated centromere on chromosome 2, but upon further investigation, the alleged degenerate centromere is just plain not there. Dr. Venema really should know about this and not be teaching such falsehoods, but perhaps he shouldn't be blamed, seeing as how such false teaching is pervasive, even included in this high school textbook being used right here in Canada. Please also notice that in the same paragraph to the textbook, they also make the flat-out false claim that chimpanzee and human genomes are 99% identical. Seeing as how the chimpanzee genome is 12% longer than the human genome, it is an obvious mathematical impossibility that they be 99% identical. Such claims wouldn't work in the grocery store. So how is it they are getting away with it in high school, college, and university science classes? A lot of this material is old news, dating back as far as 2003. Dr. Venema wrote in his essay, "For me personally, the most difficult circumstances to watch are students who feel torn between the evidence and their faith." Dr. Venema, what evidence? What evidence? The evidence you present is nothing more than wishful thinking, wild speculation, and simply interpreting actual evidence within the evolutionary context. Evolution which I could just as well interpret within the young Earth creation context. You have not provided evidence. Dr. Venema closes with, "Contrary to popular opinion, in my experience, most who do come to accept the evidence for evolution also report this growth. They feel closer to God, not further from Him. They feel that they have a deeper appreciation for and understanding of His creation." I don't know how to say this, Dr. Venema, so I'm just going to say it and hope that I don't hurt nor insult you, because that is certainly not my intention. I do not think you realize the implications of what you are teaching. Evolution thrives on mutations, sickness and disease, killing and death through survival of the fittest and natural selection. Whoever this God is that you were helping students get close to, it is not the God of the Bible, but a sick and twisted, cruel and disgusting deity who uses killing, death, disease, and sickness to allegedly improve life. There are huge theological implications to what you were teaching, Dr. Venema. Who are you going to believe? Some scientist who wasn't there? Or Jesus? Jesus rose from the dead, so obviously he knows something that you and all the other scientists do not. I'll go with what he says any day over any scientist. And he believed the creation account of Genesis, not evolution. He called death an enemy, not a tool to produce life. So to believe evolution is to say that Christ is either a liar or he's mistaken. If he's mistaken about our past, why on earth would you trust him with your future, Dr. Venema? In no way do I mean this as a personal attack against you, but rather a challenge to reevaluate what you believe and what you are teaching. And so I submit all of this to you with much respect.
What does the Bible say about aliens? Is there life on other planets? What can science tell us about the possibility of aliens? Ian Juby gives answers to these and many more questions in this fascinating and highly disturbing subject. Looking analytically at the subject, complete with the testimonies of people who claim to have been abducted by aliens. The answers will probably surprise you. In this 1.5-hour lecture, Ian shows that the alleged aliens are a problem and that Jesus is the solution. Order online today at Ian's bookstore.
Mail for me? Ah!
Yep, that's the one. East Vietnamese jumping spider. The venom is so strong that one bite can kill any child and 95% of adults. The surviving 5% typically slip into a coma for 3 to 6 months, only to wake up with permanent paralysis.
Thanks for all those who wrote in about last week's show. You'll recall I quoted Dr. Gary Parker discussing over 500 doctoral dissertations written about the forged fossil Piltdown Man. Old-time YouTuber Sweaty Tooth Madman wrote in, Dr. Gary Parker gave no reference to these 500 dissertations that were written on a single fossil, which is a rather large number of PhDs to be obtained in the field of anthropology, let alone on one specimen. What most likely happened is that he meant to use the word articles instead of PhDs. In the publication Piltdown Man, quote, it is estimated that some 500 essays were written about Piltdown Man, end quote, which may have been where Dr. Parker got his information among other sources. Thanks for calling this to my attention. You are correct. Andrew Lamb with Creation Ministries International added to this. With respect to Piltdown dissertations, there is a company called ProQuest that publishes a dissertations and thesis database, which includes entries for those from universities around the world dating from at least as far back as the mid-1800s, many decades before the Piltdown fragments were publicized in 1912. ProQuest records only 2 theses involving Piltdown Man, and both of these theses were written long after Piltdown Man was confirmed as a hoax, which was in 1953. The idea that over 500 doctoral theses were done on the Piltdown Man is incorrect, and probably derives from the second paragraph of a 1954 Nature article which said, quote, more than 500 articles and memoirs are said to have been written about Piltdown Man, end quote. Catholic scholar and former atheist Malcolm Muggeridge may have been the source of the 500 Piltdown doctorates claim, which he makes on page 59 of his book, The End of Christendom, published in 1980. Muggeridge was a satirist and a journalist, and these occupations are notorious for hyperbole. Ironically, my error and Dr. Parker's error is an example of the point I was trying to make even last week. We're all human, even scientists. Even the very anti-creation pro-evolution website Talk Origins, talking about the Piltdown escapade, wrote, it has been argued that this is a good example of science correcting its errors. This argument is a bit roseate. As the Daily Sketch wrote, anthropologists refer the hoax as another instance of desire for fame leading a scholar into dishonesty and boast that the unmasking of the deception is a tribute to the persistence and skill of modern research. Persistence and skill indeed, when they have taken over 40 years to discover the difference between an ancient fossil and a modern chimpanzee. A chimpanzee could have done it quicker. Far from being a triumph of science, the hoax points to common and dangerous faults. The hoax succeeded in large part because of the slipshod nature of the testing applied to it. Careful examination using the methods available at the time would have immediately revealed the hoax. This failure to adequately examine the fossils went unmarked and unnoticed at the time, in large part because the hoax admirably satisfied the theoretical expectations of the time. The hoax illuminates two pitfalls to be wary of in the scientific process. The first is the danger of inadequately examining and challenging results that confirm the currently accepted scientific interpretation. The second is that a result, once established, tends to be uncritically accepted and relied upon without further reconsideration. And another blunder on my part last week, pointed out by this person, this person, this person, this person, this person, and even Larry Dye, the Creation Guy. The Creation Guy operates the second Creation Museum, which opened in Alberta, that I mentioned in last week's show, the Bow Island, Alberta Creation Discovery Center. And he wrote, "Great job, Ian. By the way, two things. It's okay to mention our museum. You have my permission. And just a correction. Apollo 8 did not land on the moon. They orbited it because the lunar module wasn't ready." Thanks for the correction, everyone. The Apollo 8 was the first to orbit the moon, not the first to land there. YouTuber Oren Otter made a point I missed. So, according to Bill Nye, the most advanced innovative country on the planet, or at the very least second most advanced, which people are coming to because of its vast intellectual capital, is the only one with a significant number of people who deny evolution. So Bill is, ironically, implying that creationists represent a huge intellectual resource and are, on average, far more creative than the average evolutionist and more advanced than everyone but the Japanese. YouTuber Thinking Man 07 wrote in, "Nice work, Ian. I really appreciate the information you presented on vestigial organs and DNA. It is like history repeating itself. You could practically do 10 shows on supposed vestigial organs, some as vital as the pituitary gland, which later on were found not to be vestigial at all. Evolution actually has held mankind back. There is no telling how far where medicine would be if it weren't for evolution." Multiple people wrote in comments similar to the YouTuber Fresh Eyeball. "Evolution does not have life arising from non-life. That's abiogenesis, a different field." Evolution most certainly does include abiogenesis. I cover this in detail in Crevo Rant number 63, Evolution and the Origin of Life. Well, that's it for this week's show. I'm your host, Ian Juby. Thanks for watching. Please join us again next Genesis Week. You can send in your comments and questions by email to comments@genesisweek.com, or send us a tweet at Genesis Week, or head to our YouTube channel, genesisweek.com, and leave a comment under the appropriate show. Remember the words of our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me." We'll see you on the flip side.
We need your support to help keep this program on the air. You can help by making a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K2P4. You can also sign up for Ian's newsletter, detailing current research and news items at ianjuby.org.